in general in San Francisco. If you see it in Bay Bridge, not the Golden Gate Bridge, but the Bay Bridge, there's 25,000 LED lights. I actually worked on that with my studio. So that was a cool project we've done for San Francisco in general. So yes, I've been all around the world, you could say, but I think the most interesting part was just coming to Asia in general, because obviously working in San Francisco for maybe 8 years, I was humbled a lot in general coming to Southeast Asia, right? So I usually ask a lot of people this in general, what comes to mind when you think about Southeast Asia? Because not really, everybody thinks about technology, right? They don't really think about any of those things when they think about Southeast Asia. And I'm not talking about Asia in general, but Southeast Asia, right? You usually think about the beaches, the rice paddies, the temples, possibly the food, right? There's a lot of culture and history and a lot of interesting things here that I wasn't aware of before I came to Southeast Asia. So coming here was just a mind-blowing experience because obviously I was growing up in America and I had all these ideas about, how users or how design is perceived in Southeast Asia. And coming here was just, I think it was just a very humbling experience. And I gained a lot of knowledge in general. So with that being said, what's actually happening in Southeast Asia currently, right now, right? What's happening here in general? Well, as you know, a lot of people are investing in Southeast Asia companies, not just Grab, but obviously they've also noticed the other emerging startups that are also coming out of here, whether it's Tokopedia, whether it's Gojek. There are a bunch of other startups that people are investing right now in Southeast Asia. It's definitely a hotspot, and I'm talking about this before pre-COVID. There are a lot of interesting things happening here in general. So for me, coming here, I obviously didn't know about the startup scene, and seeing all these innovative startups just take over Southeast Asia and just innovate in general is quite amazing to me, because I was never aware of this, obviously working and living in America. So with 655 million people in total, Southeast Asia is going to be the 4th largest economy in the world by 2030. And that's pretty crazy, right? And why is that? Indonesia is the 4th largest country in the world, or in population size, right? Singapore provides one of the friendliest local entrepreneur and environment for people to run their businesses and startups in general. And it's also a competitive economy pre-COVID, right? And Vietnam, as most people are seeing right now, is becoming a superstar just because they're in between the US and Chinese trade war. They're becoming a big manufacturer as compared to China. So it's a good time to be in Southeast Asia. And I did this presentation before COVID, but I will talk about the COVID stuff as well and why you should be a little bit optimistic in general. So I don't want to bore you guys with some charts, but I will, just to show and prove that Southeast Asia is pretty much winning right now. Before COVID obviously came about, right? GDP, if you don't know, it's the gross domestic product, measures the economic activity in each country. And you can see that in Southeast Asia, it's been rising since 2013. And it's been incredible in general of what's happening here and what could be possible going into the future. And obviously you see it, and I'll switch between Asia and Southeast Asia for a little bit. This obviously measures Asia, but you can see this is Asia's time, right? We are rising consumption value, economic value, and trade value in general. And of course, what I just talked about before, right? Because of the decrease in exports in China, Vietnam's emerging along with these other countries, Cambodia, and of course, South Asia like Bangladesh, India, and all these other countries that are rising as well. And with that being said, if you look at these charts, right, these countries, the urbanization is increasing in a lot of the countries down here in Southeast Asia. And as I mentioned before, Indonesia is going up along with Thailand, India, and Vietnam. And all these green and yellow, red dots, they're just showing all the cities that are growing, and that probably the urban areas will drive the future economic growth of these areas in general in the future. Not saying right now, obviously, but in the future, you can see with urbanization, education improving in all these areas in all these countries, it's going to drive the growth for Southeast Asia. But with that being said, right, COVID, governments, it's causing a lot of issues right now, whether you're in Indonesia or the Philippines. So I'm well aware of that. Unfortunately, this is happening right now, but it is a problem, right? It's causing a lot of negative sentiment. It's not great, but there is hope in general. There's a lot of early indications that, containment is here. There's new protocols coming in, and there's a resumption of economic activity. That can't be said for all countries, with that being said, but it is happening in a few countries. So I won't read off the slides, but I'll call out the 6 things that contribute to Asia as a whole to the response to the COVID pandemic. And you're seeing it in some countries, whether it's Singapore, Vietnam, Thailand, and other countries where they've embraced, the safeguard of the social contract with the government, right? Whether it's contact tracing, informing the people in the country that, hey, there's an area that has a lot of COVID cases, you might want to not go out, having a lockdown. A lot of these countries have also embraced working from home. Obviously, a lot of the startups have now digitized a lot of their products and gone all into e-commerce, right? And you're starting to see that. And as I mentioned before, there's a watertight now contact tracing here. They're leveraging technology to improve the health care in general of Southeast Asia, and they're trying to communicate this timely with the public. So that's important to call out, especially when you look at America and the Western countries, right? It's sort of a mess there, but in general, in Asia and Southeast Asia are rising to the challenge. Obviously, a few countries still have a few issues, but hopefully that will be alleviated in the future. And then with Vietnam becoming the rising star right now, you can see they've been rising imports and exports, and obviously they don't have a lot of COVID cases, right? So there's a lot of room for startups to innovate, a lot of room for manufacturing to actually still happen. So there is a way, obviously with Vietnam leading the way, to still innovate and to be a leader in Southeast Asia. And as a whole, Southeast Asia is and will get through this and become better going forward. So when you're designing for Southeast Asia, what does that entail? Because it is complex when it comes to technology in general, right? And designing for Grab is definitely a bit of a challenge in general. So to create a smart and impactful product, you have to localize. So if you've seen my talks before, you may see that I'm repeating myself. You may have seen these slides, but it's true. I'll go into the details again about why this is important, why you must localize, hyper-localize, especially for Southeast Asia in general. You have to focus on the customer's journey. And what I mean by that is you have to actually talk to your users, because every country is very different. Every customer's journey is very different, whether it's Indonesia, it's Singapore, or Thailand or Vietnam. Every customer has different expectations. Every customer has different feelings when they come to use your app, whatever it is, right? And they have different understanding or education backgrounds to actually use your app. So this is me actually talking to these folks in general, having dinner with users that actually don't use Grab Food. So at this point, I was working on Grab Food, and these users, they didn't want to use any food apps at all. They hated the fact of actually going out, staying in and actually ordering food. They actually loved the idea of going out, eating with friends and family, having warm food that's cooked for them. And for them, that was important. It wasn't about, the accessibility to food right away. It was actually that nice, warm, family-friendly feeling of actually going out and just, being social with each other. Obviously, it's changed because of COVID, but before that, right, it was this nice experience for them in general. So these folks, they didn't want to use the food app whatsoever. They were more interested in this feeling. And obviously, for me, I was super humbled by it, because talking to them, and this is in Vietnam, that they noticed that technology is evolving. but we couldn't win them over, whether it was promos, whether it's incentives, right? There was no winning them over. So for me, that was humbling because at least I knew there were users like that would use the app in general, or even be bothered, which is super interesting because it's like, how do we win these people over, right? There might be no way to win them over, but at least we talked to these users. We understood where they were coming from. And as I mentioned before, we understood their actual points of, okay, they're not going to use the app. That's fine. Let's try to go for other users and learn from this and maybe possibly get to them in the future. But you never know, right? People change, but these folks were pretty steadfast in their beliefs. So not just talking to them, but talking to other people, we actually created personas for food that didn't exist. And this is maybe a year or 2 years ago, where we created personalities for these users that actually order Grab food. We had one personality, which is go-getter, that's quick decision maker. They know what they want. They don't want to delay things. They will instantly buy what they usually probably choose, right? What they order again, in general. Connoisseur, someone that's really picky. Maybe they're a vegetarian and they can't have certain things at a restaurant that has meat. So they're picky in general. So how do we cater to these folks? Entertainer, maybe they're a social butterfly. They have large groups, whether it's the office or a family environment. How do we cater to the people that order large orders in general? Caregiver, so someone that's probably a mom, or maybe it's a father where they take care of kids, or maybe they're taking care of grandparents. How can I look over and order for my parents at home or my kids? And someone that's an adventurer, right? We call them YOLOer, where they like things that are trendy or Instagrammable, right? And they take pictures of that, whether it's bubble tea or maybe it's some new fancy dish in Indonesia. These people like to experiment things in general. So let's go deep dive into Grab Food 2017 in general, when I first came in, and I'll show why, how we catered to Southeast Asia through this case study. So you can see, right, I like to call it a green mess in 2017. It's all over the place. There are some things that I really didn't understand about the experience in general, right? So which is the address, which is the search bar, is a little bit confusing. The ads were a little bit also off. Was this an ad or is this a promotion? It says promotion here, but it's like an ad. Plus with the restaurant photo, right? It's also, there's ad type on it as well. It's a bit confusing. And then when you go into the menu, at least I start realizing, oh, cool, it's an actual restaurant image, but still has the text that says, there's promo deals and whatnot. And then you have the layout with plus buttons. Then you go into the basket where it's sort of a visual mess, and then into where you're getting the food, which has 3 steps, to get the pickup, the driver's going to pick up the food and deliver it to you in general. So for us, when we looked at this, right, we didn't have any findings in 2017. We wanted to start learning how our users actually use food in general. So you can see we went through multiple iterations. We talked to our users with each iteration of the Grab Food app. And as well, we also obviously developed into a super app. So we had to house different types of services as well. But we had to think about our users, right? Especially in Southeast Asia. You can see the evolution from that green mess to now this really nice, clean and comforting homepage for people that order for food. And with that being said, we had to hyper localize. And this is the most important part that I stressed before, right? So in Singapore, right, you may have island-wide delivery. You want to call that out, especially in Singapore, because it's a small country. You want to call out the local heroes, self-pickup, Mart, and all these nice things. But let's say you're in a different country, or you're a different persona in a different country. You're focused on different things. Example would be maybe if you're in Indonesia, those users love restaurants that are near to them. So how do you cater to these folks, right? Well, you probably will have to change the name. You'll obviously have to cater to the large Muslim population there. Surface halal, right, for most folks. And again, most people like to shop or get food that's close to them. So how do you represent the local heroes? Maybe they want to pick up. Obviously, Mart's a big deal. So how do we get people to actually, look at these things? So I think with Grab Food launching into different countries back then, we had to hyper localize this experience for each country. So what you get in Singapore might be actually different in Indonesia versus Vietnam. There are a lot of different takes and personas, as we mentioned, but when it deep dives into the culture and how people actually eat and order food, as I pointed out, it's very different. So you have to hyper localize for that, and you have to be smart about it. If you don't strategize around that, then obviously you're not catering to that country, right? You're just assuming that everyone acts the same or reacts the same to your design, and that's not the greatest way to go, because people will give you that feedback on the ground, and I know that is true based on research. And as I talked about, right, from previous research sessions, people give me that feedback, like, why don't you cater to the Muslim population in Indonesia? Why don't you surface things for like alcohol? Because I usually drink a lot and it's legal here, right? So how do we cater to these cases? And how do we make sure that we strategize what's surface and what's not? So, obviously Grab Food 2020, it's different, it's cleaner, it's easy for users to order food, it's easy for users to go down the funnel in general, from the homepage to the menu to the basket, and obviously getting their food as well. And with that being said, right, the Grab Food's user base has been growing 10% each month, which is wild. And from our findings, we've seen that Grab Food is one of the most often used food delivery platforms in Southeast Asia after the redesign, which is pretty impressive. So again, I want to stress that if you don't talk to your users, if you don't understand people's culture, you're not gonna win in general. You have to realize that every country is very different. You may have to cater a little bit, especially based on culture or religion, but you have to strategize and plan around that. People don't. An example: if someone from an outside country came in and opened up a food app down here, and they just focused based off maybe the Western values, it wouldn't work. And for me, coming from America, right, and understanding that I've used Uber Eats and DoorDash, it's very different when you come here, because you have to be very sensitive to how people really, look at your app, and they do ask their questions, right? Like, well, what about me? What about my culture? What about everything that I like to eat versus the West, right? It's very focused here, so you have to focus more so on the culture and the things that people will usually go to. So you have to cater to that in general. So I'm going to pause. Just, do people have questions in general? Let me stop sharing really quick. Questions? Let's see. How do you central design for multiple cultures? So that's a good question. So I think for Grab Food or Grab, you have to think about strategically what are your priorities in general. You have to lay those pillars out for your design and with product as well. Obviously, it's a partnership, right? You also have to align with the business team. So with Grab Food, we actually had a design sprint where we actually had everyone in one room. It was the business team, the marketing team, ops, engineering, business, product, design, research. And we actually got together and figured out what the pillars are that were the focus for food and what was surfaced to all our users. And that was the central idea. That was the central design in general, right? And then on top of that, or the next layer, right, is how do we strategize and attack different countries, whether it's Indonesia, Vietnam, or the Philippines? And how do we adhere to the government as well? So there's some things that, when you're designing or creating a product, you have to deal with regulations from different countries and governments in general. So with that being said, right, you have a central focus, but at least you have some things, whether you worked it out with the business and operations side along with the government regulations, and then you surface those. Regardless of the pillars you may have, obviously it'll change depending on where you're designing for, who you're aiming at. So in Indonesia, as I mentioned, right, you obviously have a large Muslim population. You probably do want to surface halal. You probably want to, give people the poke that, hey, there's a mosque nearby. Maybe you want to, take a break and go there if you're a driver. So there's some things in general that you have to think about. So next question, as a non-native speaker, how do you get around research challenges so deeply authentically understand the needs. So yeah, so we actually have on the ground, we do have translators there in general. So we do have an awesome research team that lets us organize that back then. So I went on maybe like 10, 15 like research sessions probably, and I had a local translator with us. And it also helped that my previous manager also spoke Bahasa in Indonesia. So that helped a lot because I got to learn a lot in general and learn Bahasa from him, which was pretty cool. But of course he was a local and I would hear like him talking to local shops. And that's one thing that you also have to, think about. Don't just focus on like large merchants or large companies. You have to focus on the local businesses, the local shops in general, that you'll actually get a lot more findings from the local shops in general, local businesses, because they're dealing with a lot of issues centrally in that country, right? It's not like a big company like maybe like McDonald's as an example, which may have a lot of money in general to like spend versus like maybe a local merchant or a local business. And how do you empower those guys, right? So you have to strategize really around hyper localizing these areas, and you have to think about that in general. So that's how we did it. That's how we ended up talking to whether it's merchants or users. I had a translator, and I think now we do also have like translators, but obviously it's through Zoom. Okay, so next question, how does your design team work to stand a central design that do I'll get to that. I'm going to talk about design systems in the next part, so I will get to that. Just like to know, what are your biggest obstacles you faced when you try local research in a new country? I think the biggest obstacle was probably logistics, actually, like figuring out where it would be and why. So obviously we were focused on Indonesia maybe 2 years ago because we needed to get findings on Indonesia. We didn't have any of that at all. And we wanted to relaunch food back then. So we needed to understand the Indonesian market really well. And we needed to understand the mindset there. So he was trying to figure out, okay, if we're gonna just research in Indonesia, where else do we have to research in? So logistic wise, like obviously Jakarta, probably Surabaya, maybe look at Medan, and maybe Makassar, right? So looking at the big cities and really strategizing where you get valid findings from a large country like that. And then obviously as food evolved, you do want to look at, different countries, and which has like maybe the second largest market, whatever that is. And for us, I wanted to really understand Vietnam and why everyone was ordering food the way they are. So like some findings, it's very different from Indonesia and Vietnam. I mean, obviously everyone loves promotions, but in Vietnam, they are very promo savvy. They they love exploring food. They love trying Korean food, Japanese food, Western food, versus maybe like Indonesia. They just focused on, local food as Indonesian cuisines, right? So that was very interesting in general. How much influence does market size determine design priorities for certain products? Imaginary scenario, Grab Food, Singapore's bigger business, Grab Food, Vietnam. Do you prioritize design for Singapore compared to the VN? Yeah, that's a good question. I'll answer it a little bit vague because I can't answer that whole question. But in general, obviously, we try to design for the best use case that works for everybody. Obviously, we'll work with business to figure out what those cases are. Obviously, we also have personas as well that we can relate to. But when you're looking at the business and obviously the metrics that are happening, right? As I mentioned before, there are 4 or 5 pillars, whatever those pillars are that you aim for. You have to make that the standard for across the whole region, right? Whether it's maybe ordering again, whether it's, food history, what these people, what folks in general order to or gravitate to, obviously are going to take the main points. So you prioritize that. And then obviously if you're aiming for a different market or looking to grow into an extended market and you want to hyper localize, how do you do that, right? You have to learn what's important to the folks in Vietnam, Thailand, or the Philippines. Do you elevate promotions into maybe those pillars, like because people care about promotions, or do you maybe have a carousel that just focuses on the deals that are closest to you, right? So you have to really balance that out, obviously with your teams in general, but that's how you would usually do it for that case. How do you calculate impact of design changes? That's a good one. That's we don't have design metrics per se, but I think for me to calculate impact, I think it's probably looking at the metrics in the overall metrics, right, and seeing the data if people actually click on things uh, or actually ignore content. And I think one of the things that I wanted to mention is content's important. I think people usually, for whatever reason, push content as the last thing, and I'll get to that in the design system cases that I'll show in the second half of this talk. But content is king. If you don't have a content writer with you, then you're failing in general of the actual impact that design and content is doing. So if people say, you know, content is just content, that's a lie. Content is the design. Design is content. You can't have content without the design, right? You're literally designing and laying it out with content. So I think one of the most important things that I've also learned is, and it goes back to our previous question above about localizing. I think we had a content writer in our actual user research sessions, and that helped so much because they could write in Bahasa or Vietnamese, and they could obviously localize that content for each country, right? Because some folks would react very differently for a thank you in Bahasa versus maybe a thank you in Vietnamese, because it's probably more formal or robotic in how you say it in Bahasa. So having that content writer actually localizes and makes the user that's reading it feel a lot better, right? So that's impact right there, right? Do they feel more comfortable using a platform versus another? And we've had cases where people actually tell us, hey, your content's actually nice. It feels very local. There's a lot of slang in it. It feels like you understand me, which is cool. That's a good compliment to get. So you have to understand the basis of content. I think people, you know, don't make content as important as it should be. So if I were a company that was expanding right now, I would heavily invest in content because it does change the game in general. So I'll take 3 more questions. So save the questions for later, guys. So I'll take 3 more and I'll continue with the presentation. So I guess it's quite normal that user needs change. Sometimes users may want something during one user interview, but then they change their mind. How should we designers? Yeah, that's a good question. So I wouldn't be reactive. I think for designers, I think we get reactive in general, whether it's from outside pressure or whether it's, you know, going to one user research session. I think obviously I was blessed to have multiple research sessions and actually see my designs, how people reacted to my designs in Vietnam or Indonesia or even like the Philippines, right? So you have to go through multiple sessions, and you can do that on Zoom now. That's easy, or even Gorilla Test. You don't have to, you know, you don't need to have like serious sessions. Go out and test it with other people. Take out the company name out of your designs and reformat it so you can go out and Gorilla Test it. You'll get findings easier that way, and you'll get understandings from different people, different perspectives, and that's the most important part, right? So don't be so reactive in general, and measure how you research and who you talk to, because you'll get really good responses from younger or older people, and that's how I would do it in general. That's how you should do these research sessions. So you have a lot of different personas. Do you usually separate those personas in different countries as well? Yes, we do. It goes pretty deep. We have different layers actually for each persona. I obviously didn't show all of the personas that we have, but yes, there are different personas for each country in general. So example, maybe people in the Philippines may be very focused on promotions or being adventurous versus Indonesia. Again, this is just an example, right? Where people, they're just, you know, they know what they want. They're a go-getter in Indonesia. They just want local food. So in general, right, it's very different. And then we go deeper. There's other layers that there's so many like personas that are underneath those personas. It's crazy, but those are the main ones in general, right? So you want to set that up. If you ever have personas, have a main set, obviously, of personas, but as you do your design, you do your research, you're going to find that there's a lot more layers underneath it all. And you may not cater to those different personas, right? But at least you have these pillars that you can point to. And I keep going back to the word pillars because you have to set those up whether it's with the business, product, or design, and then even research, you have to set that up. So at least everyone has a North Star to point to and be like, yes, that's where I want to lean my findings on, and at least I can build off that. So one last question before I get into it again. So in a developing country that's price sensitive and highly competitive, would you prioritize design around enhancing experience of target consumer segments or design for attracting non-consumers? That's a good question. I would prioritize enhancing experience of the target consumer segments because obviously for food, it's obviously getting better. It's more beautiful now than it was before. And that's not just because of me. It was my awesome team that has been working on it for the past 2 years. They've been awesome, but you have to realize, you have to take baby steps and you have to phase things out. Not the whole design is going to be beautiful in the beginning, obviously because of resources or product or whatever it is, right? There's disagreements on things. You have to start off phasing things in, whether it's a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and start off small. Baby steps before you get to that ideal vision. So what with design, right? What that design sprint did that I talked about before, when we had product and business and marketing all in one room, we decided this is the vision of food. Okay, let's now go back and see how we can create this through phases. And we did. We created food through phases, and we got to that vision of where it is right now, where it's catered and hyper localized for each country, and it understands the users ordering preferences, whether it's ordering again or whether they want the things that are closer to them. That's important. So yeah, I would start off small first and do experiments as well, right? Whether it's content changes, whether it's design changes, do experiments because you'll get findings quicker that way. And you'll start implementing and getting findings through that, and you'll figure out what's the best experience going forward. That would be my answer for that. So let me go back into the presentation, and I'll talk about the technical aspects of a design system for developing countries. So let me stop my video and start sharing again. So hold your questions until after this. Okay, so designing around limitations. This is now talking about the technical aspects, actually designing for developing nations in general. So limitations, right? Your limitations when you're designing are design systems. If you don't have the perfect design system for different countries, it gets pretty crazy. So I have here on the screen an English version, maybe when you're in Singapore, a version that's in Bahasa if you're in Indonesia, and then one in Thai. So when you start creating or expanding your design system in general, you can't just assume that it's gonna adhere to every country and every language. I think obviously coming from a country that has one language, English, right? Or even Spanish, of course. But it gets harder when you come to a country that has different characters and it has to serve different purposes. So when you're designing a system, you have to take this into account. And that's why, again, I'm going to stress that having a content person is key when you're designing the system, because you can lay out the character count when you have that content. You can work with the engineer and tell them, hey, this is going to be one line. It's going to be 15 characters. Because it can scale for each country. So you have to think about these things when you're actually building the design system and building a design for every country. You can't just assume that everyone's going to read English, everyone's going to read Bahasa. What if you start expanding within a year from now, right? How's that going to help the design team build a design for that country in general? So you have to start thinking about these things in a holistic way in general. So again, another thing that I was also humbled by when I came here was the currencies are crazy, right? Like the currencies, not just in Singapore, but Bahasa and then Thailand, there's different scalabilities for that. So you have to think about that when you're designing a system. So I don't have this here, but Vietnamese dong is like 9 digits. And because, it's not, I think it's 6 digits actually, but you have to work with the regulatory regulations, the government, because they will have these regulations that you have to follow. You can't just cut the numbers because it looks nice. That doesn't work that way. You have to actually work with the government and the regulations because this is how people read currency in general. So that was a big, for me, a shocker, obviously, when I was designing in different countries. And when you're building a system out, you have to make sure that you cater, obviously, for the government, the regulations. It's not easy. And then for these lines, right, when I was working with engineering and my team, you have to set the line limit. So obviously, this may not going to be controllable by content, but from a merchant side, right, how do you make this sound nice or look nice, I mean, in Bahasa or in Thai? And how do you make sure the system is set up for success? So example, for the description here, I told the engineers, hey, let's have this at four lines, and we'll truncate it after that. Because based off data, I worked with operations, I looked at, hey, what's the average description line per merchant? They would say 4 lines, X amount of characters. Usually for items, it's usually 2 lines because there are some crazy names out there. Where you're in Bahasa or Vietnam, it might go 2 lines. And then obviously I would also ask operations like, what is the currency length as well, character length for most of the items at a shop. So you have to dig deep. You have to ask these questions. You can't just assume that a system is going to work for everybody. You have to understand that every language is very different, and setting these parameters with your engineering and your design system, it helps actually scale your design for each case, right? So you can see here on ViewBasket, it's very nice, clean, but obviously when you get to Indonesia, it gets a bit crazy. In Thai, you can see, the Thai language breaks it a little bit because there's no like font weight for that. So that's another thing, right? When you're picking fonts, pick a font that actually scales for each country. You can't just assume that your medium, light, and regular weight is going to tell you the same thing in every language, right? So you have to understand when you pick a font, make sure it scales. Work with your engineers in setting these standards for the design system, because at least you can also bring these standards to other teams, right? Don't think just about your team, but think about other teams that could use these systems that you put in place. So this is a crazy one. So we did launch GrabFood in Myanmar, and that was challenging because Zogi, which is the irregular font in Myanmar, and it's the spoken language there, it is the font that was not designed for an iOS. In general, it's changed, luckily, but in general, Zogi and Unicode, as most people know, Unicode is the language that iOS uses. Unicode actually flips Zogi around. So if you were to write a sentence in regular language like "I like you," in Zogi, that would sound "I like you." But if Unicode came in, it would actually flip the whole grammar around. It would be like you, I. So, which is pretty wild that the world didn't design for Zogi and the grammar. And you can only imagine the pain that people in Myanmar are feeling right now because of that. Because obviously they grew up, typing on a Zogi keyboard. But because it's a developing country, not a lot of people know that. It's the same with Cambodia or Laos, right? You have to understand that every country is very different. And as much of this looks like a mess, I had to design a system around that. I had to make sure that there's a system in place. I had to work with a content person that actually spoke and wrote Zogi. And obviously I had to set limits for this. So luckily we had a font that serves its purpose in Myanmar, but you can see it breaks the system if you didn't really look at things at a scalable view, right? You have to look at it and take a step back. Does this scale for every country? If it doesn't, then it's going to break your system. People are not going to read it. And again, that's why I keep saying content is king. If you don't have someone that actually speaks the language and actually focuses the text for these users in different countries, then you're not helping that country out. You're not helping those people out. How would you feel if someone designed an app that didn't service English or Mandarin? That I'd be pretty pissed about that, right? So make sure that you do have the right people around you, whether it's content, whether it's having the right scalability with your engineers, right, having the right design system, and having that perspective. I think this is what I really took away from designing for different countries. And then I know when we launched the redesign of food in Indonesia, we had to also, think about the language and how people, perceive things. So it is important. It's important that you have to take these into account when you're scaling up not just your product, but your design and your content, because people will react to this in whatever way. So a few things before I get back into Q&A, right? I think some other learnings and takeaways when I've been designing for here is, especially in Southeast Asia, not every country is going to use, a Samsung Galaxy or iOS. Obviously, in Vietnam, that's the largest Southeast Asia country that actually uses iOS, which is pretty interesting. But, if you're in Indonesia and you're designing for Android phone, right, because that Android phone does take up most of the market, you can't just assume that, the width on the phone is going to be capable to hold your design. So you have to take that into account. You can't just, assume that the widths are going to be the same as a Galaxy phone or an iOS phone. There might be different iOSs that they might be using, whether it's like iPhone 6, iPhone 8, or iPhone 5 or whatever. So be aware of that. It's important when you're designing. I think another thing that I was also having to think about when I came here was, people use Wi-Fi a lot in the public spaces, especially. So you have to think about when you design something, what does that loading state look like? What does that look like? What happens when things load in? Should you use, a high-res image, or should you use something that's low-res that, easily loads in Indonesia? I know this is a known fact, right, that you have to be aware of that. But people take their mobile data here seriously. They're very religious about that, right? And most people turn on airplane mode in general. So you have to be aware of that when you're designing, especially in like Indonesia or maybe like Myanmar. People don't like using their phone data. So how do you cater to these folks in general? And you also have to be culturally aware. That's the most important part that I've been learning, being humbled, right, about in general, because not everybody's gonna have the same cultural beliefs as you do. So how do you design and cater for these folks, whether it's they're because they eat halal, or they may not drink alcohol and they perceive that as like sinful, right? So how do we make sure that the app that we're designing is sensitive to those things in general? And another thing, right, not just with personas that also come into play, not just countries, but you have to think about the personas that are out here, right? So as I talked about culture, people still use cash and versus like, cashless. Obviously the younger generation, they may be focused on using cashless, but the older generation still uses cash, right? Cash is still king. So how do you make sure that experience caters to those folks? You can't just assume everyone's gonna use cashless. How do you make sure that people are still served in that regard? I think some of the findings that I've found, especially going into Indonesia over here, right, and talking to folks, I've noticed a lot of people are very patient. They have empathy for the drivers that are delivering them food. They like I mentioned before earlier in the talk, they're very into local food. They're not technology advanced, but they really take into consideration their family, the people that serve them in general. They take care of those folks, versus maybe like Vietnam, where they want things quick. They don't like exploring things. They read all the details, versus maybe Indonesia, it's a struggle for them to read English, or they may not understand the actual bahasa that's given to them. So how do you make sure that people understand that, whether it's a visual, whether it's an animation? How do you make sure that people understand like what they're getting themselves into in an experience? How do you cater to that? And as I mentioned, right, people in Vietnam use iOS phones and they bike everywhere. So how do you make sure that drivers are catered to on a two-wheel environment, right? When they're on a bike, it's very tricky when you're delivering food and you have to look at a phone for directions. So how do you make sure this driver is taken care of when they're delivering food to you, versus someone that's in a four-wheel, maybe in Singapore? It's very different. And then of course, like in Singapore, people are very opinionated in general. They pay attention to all the details, versus like Indonesia, where, like I mentioned, they may be emphatic. So you have to cater to these personalities, and take this into account when you're hyper localizing. Not everyone's going to be a fan of your design, your experience, but of course, that's going to be a few folks. Just make sure that you cater to the pillars that you set up for each country, and you strategize around that, and you should be okay. So other personal takeaways that ever since I've been working in Southeast Asia. So if you've seen me talk, I've brought this up before, right? When you're collaborating, save feature ideas and don't work in silos. I think that's the most important part ever since I've been out here. Work as a team, not as one. Because some of these ideas that come out, whether it's not just from your design team, but the engineering team, product team, there are some really good ideas that come from those folks. So don't isolate yourself, whether you're a designer or product or whoever you are. Just work as a team, not as one. And one thing I like to tell everybody when I've been designing for Southeast Asia is treat every user as if they were your grandmother, not like a data point. And what I mean by that is, your grandmother obviously may not be technologically advanced as you are, but how do you get her up the stairs, right? Do you hold her hand? Does she need a light? How do you make sure she gets on every step from point A to point B? And that's what I mean. You have to really make sure that the system and experience that's in place, make sure that your grandmother actually gets through it, understands what they're doing, and is taken care of, right? You don't want to harm your grandmother. You want to make sure she gets somewhere safe. So think about every user as your grandmother. I think that's what I've learned ever since being out here in Southeast Asia. Another thing, right? Don't get attached to your designs. I know we get precious about our designs in general. We don't want to share. Check your ego, because I think for us, right, design is iteration. It's the nature of our job. It's part of evolution. You're not going to be at a company for 4 or 5 years, right? And if you are, someone may take that position that you were on, or you may go to a different part of the company. Someone's going to redesign whatever you've been working on prior. So don't get precious about your designs. Don't get attached. Just know that this is part of now. Iteration is going to happen regardless whether you're there or not. It's going to happen. So don't get attached to your designs. And as I mentioned before, the content is design. I can't stress that enough. Content is king. People will either not understand your experience because the content's bad, or they'll understand it and feel better that the language is hyper localized for them. Doesn't have a lot of slang terms, or it's not robotic. However the user reacts to it, you have to take that into account. So content is definitely king. Definitely get a UX writer or content person to really understand your users, because you can at least have a terminology that can scale, not just for your team, but for the rest of the team that may want to use that same terminology. And last thing, design is always at a seat table. We just haven't sat down. And what that means is, what does that mean? Everyone is looking for a designer's opinion, but we haven't sat down and actually talk the same language as maybe a product person, a data person, or business person. We have to understand how they talk to each other. We have to understand the systems that are around it. Go to those monthly business meetings. Understand why the business does what it does, right? Go to those product meetings and understand why product reacts the way it does, with a design that's maybe new or not. You have to understand each branch per se of the tree that you're working on, right? You can't just assume that everyone's going to understand everything. So yeah, design's always had a seat at the table. You just have to understand where everyone's coming from and have that perspective. Because if you don't have like that perspective in general, then you're just designing for yourself, and that's not very good. So thank you guys for listening. I'm going to go into Q&A. So let's stop sharing and look at the questions. Cool. So let's see. Developing country has price since, so any questions? I'm gonna does localizing language slow down your design process? No, it does not. So for us, we do have our process in general where we do have content in place. It's a content process where we make sure that content, well, for for me in general, right? It depends on your team. So let me preface this. It depends on your team and how you work with content. Usually I bring in the content person in the beginning and to let them know this is the design that I want to aim for. And I want to make sure that product's also there to make sure that we're all aligned on the content, right? Because you can't just assume that, you can't just pull content in at the last moment. That's like the worst thing you could do to a content person. Make sure that content is there in the beginning, in the end, wherever, whether it's in the research sessions, whether it's in business meetings or product meetings, make sure the content person is aligned. Make sure you keep them, in the loop of things, right? That makes the design easier. So we want to first obviously nail down the English content first, but when we localize it, right, like make sure before you design that localized content, you finalize the English content or the main content in general for that country, because at least it will flow and people will have an idea of it. Then you can localize the content for each country going forward, and people will understand this is, this is what works for this country in this type of lingo. And then we'll either user test it before it goes live, or it'll just go live and we'll see how people react to it in general. How do you derive the various personas pillars that are derived from talking to people? Or do you search for people to talk to based on various personas? So it depends. So I think if there's not a lot of time, we'll just guerrilla test in general and talk to people at random. And I think that you get really awesome findings through that. And I know PM, who's actually here, who does that. He goes, talks to people in Indonesia, which is pretty awesome, and gets findings that way and guerrilla test stuff. So props to you. I know you know who I'm talking about. And I think you can also have an organized research session in general if you want. And we usually put out a survey of what we're looking for. And in general, we have our team look for those folks in general. So if I were to set up a session where people may use our competitor versus us, how do we reach out to them? Do we want someone that's a student that uses our competitor app versus us? Like I want a split difference. So it depends on how you organize it. For me, I usually want to get findings from people that use our competitors and then also us, and so I can get a balanced finding on how people react to our app or experiences in general. When you say content, is it content writer, copywriter, or UX designer? It's content writer, UX writer as they call it now. So someone also asked this question on Twitter to me, whether a technical writer is the same thing. I think UX writers are born and bred within the battle. I think you can become a UX writer, even if you're a regular writer, but it's not the designer that should be making the content, if that's what you're asking. If the designer is doing the content, there are some problems there. You should have a content writer with you at all times to make sure that content is, obviously sounds nice, doesn't sound robotic, and, of course, you can localize that content as well. So have localized content for different countries. Could you change line heights based on language? One of the screens had quite narrow line heights. Is that because of depth constraints? Yes, it depends on the font that you choose. So again, that's why you have to have a font that actually scales for each country. So that's a good question. So when we chose the font that we did for Grab, it scaled for every language at that point in time. And one thing I should mention is, Zoggy, or in Myanmar, they're finally just scaled to Unicode. So they're never going to use Zoggy again in applications. So, which is great for designers because we don't have to think about it that bad. So it's now just Unicode. So it's just one straight font, which is pretty easy for us to design for. But yeah, pick a font that has good line heights for every language. You have to test it. That's the only way you're going to find out. So that's a good question. Yes, engineers do have to play with the line heights depending on the language, but they shouldn't have to depending on the font that you pick. How do you check each language fit in your design? Some languages are very long, some are short. Yeah, you have to do it manually, or the engineers will pretty much call you out on, hey, you didn't think about the design, the font's getting truncated, and you don't want that to happen. You have to, you either go to Google Translate or you talk to your, luckily, I have coworkers that are like Vietnamese and or Indonesian, right? And we can, stress test things. So my recommendation is just go to Google Translate, obviously, which is a simple way to do it, and just stress test your design. You have to make sure that it fits. You have to make sure each language fits manually. If you're not, then you're not thinking about things holistically as a designer, right? You have to think about things holistically and who's using your product. You can't just be one tunnel vision in general. You have to think about how it in different use cases. How do you decide between what aspects of design are localized and what aspects are maintained generic? So as I mentioned before, earlier, right, you have to make sure there are pillars that you look up to for each country. And you set those pillars up first for the overall design. And then obviously when you start doing research, you set those main pillars up for each country in the hyper-localized version. So whatever those hyper-localized things that users are attracted to through research and findings, you want to make sure you surface that up to the customers. It depends obviously on their personas, right? But make sure you cater to that country. If you're not, then you're failing. How accepted and supported is user research as a concept in business organizations? Is it an exception or is there a norm? I think it depends on that's a good question. That's a fair question. I think, coming from the West, I don't think, some companies do care about user research. Some companies don't, and I won't name those companies just to be fair. But in general, I think user research is becoming an important thing, especially when you're expanding into different countries. Well, I think, especially if you start seeing like what China is doing, right? If you look at DD, they expanded to Australia, South America. And when I visited their office, maybe like last year, they did have user researchers there on the ground, understanding the culture and how people ordered, a DD car or DD food, whatever they're doing each country. So it's not just, Asia, I guess, but in Southeast Asia, I think it's becoming a thing, especially if you want to expand, and it's becoming important. When working with limited budget, how can we make sure that user interviews are maximized? Good question. That's a great question. So again, if you don't want to spend obviously money, guerrilla test, that's the most important part. And before you guerrilla test, make sure that you have an organized structure that you obviously ask to the user, right? And if you're aiming to, get students or get a certain demographic, go to those places, go to college, right? Stand outside and just, ask people for feedback on the experience. Or if you're focused on maybe, the older generation, maybe go near the malls or nursing homes, whatever it is. You have to focus who you're actually testing with in general. And guerrilla tests for me, remaking those scenarios with people outside helps me a lot because I'm on a budget, right? So how do I make sure that I can do that? And you can Zoom now, right? So if you're Zooming, it obviously helps everything. So you can also Zoom user test now. So you can maybe, do some testing with your grandmother, whoever it is. I think it's become easier because we're on Zoom. How is the design team at Grab structured? Do you allocate certain number of UI designers, researchers for each feature? I think, obviously there's head of designs. We do have a certain number of designers for each team. Things are spread out because of, what takes, priority in general, right? So we do have copywriters for Grab in general, but there's a lot of cross collaboration. I think that's important. We're not split differently for each region, but we do cross collaborate with whether it's designers, content writers, or researchers in general to get findings. And we make sure that there's a database that we can reach these findings or the content, right? Because if we want to use the same terminology from, what maybe the transport team or the team that lets us book cars on food, or maybe the safety team, we reach out and make sure that it's the same. We also have like design reviews as well, where we, make sure that everything is aligned in general in the experiences, components, content. That's all called out in critiques as well. What teams do I usually work with? So I work with pretty much most teams. I'm not focused. I work obviously with the design team, but for me, I would like to make sure that I keep in contact with the operations team, product team, of course, and engineers, researchers. So all teams, I think, are important. If you're just working with your design team, I would try to expand your senses, because you won't learn anything if you just stick to, talking to designers. You have to expand your thought and talk to other folks. Thanks for an informative talk. Do you have specifically aim focus on frequency personas, or do you derive some research and interviews? So we had some frequency personas. We had assumptions before I came to food. They weren't really written out or focused before, but then once we started, obviously going out and testing and going to interviews, we started deriving from that research and interviews, and help make us, start organizing a structure for each persona that was in place that you saw. So that was important, because obviously, it's good to have assumptions, but once you start going out and research, you start, structuring all the findings in general. Is there a centralized design system for different grad products, or is it up to each product to determine their grad design system? There is a centralized design system for grab in general. So yes, it's centralized, but of course, certain teams will, go off and create new components, but of course we have to make sure that we're aligned. So we have conversations back and forth with teams, because obviously teams move at different speeds versus another, right? So it can't be all perfect. I know Facebook even struggles with this, even though there's like 200 plus people, 200 plus designers on the design system team, and they still struggle with design components. So it's just collaborating and communication, making sure that, whether there's emails or whether there's a centered database for all these design components that people are aware of. It's all about awareness and communication. That's the most important part. But yes, there is a centralized design system. Is it advised to conduct user research with the same group of people? I wouldn't. I mean, it's good to focus. It depends on the product again. If it really depends on the product. So if you want to keep testing different experiences on the same people, it depends on what your goals are, right? So you could do that, but are you going to learn anything? Well, it depends on what you're trying to learn. So I would recommend obviously testing on different people, but if you're just focused, laser focused, especially on like certain users and a story to tell, and it's a long-term type of product that someone's going to use over the course of time, then maybe you would, focus on that, focus on the same group of people. That is. How do you manage design system with multiple platforms? Is it one platform? Yeah, so that's a good question. I think having multiple design systems will happen wherever you are, but it's good to have one base. I think for us, we loved using abstract, but now of course everybody's now loving Figma. So it's just getting people to buy into that vision, whatever that vision is. But I'm a recent convert of Figma, so I love Figma. So possibly the design system might be on Figma overall, but it's best to have one platform. Scrub typeface, custom typeface built in-house like Netflix Sans is not a custom. No, it's not built in-house, if that's what you're asking. Which font is recommended such that it works for all languages? Also, which design? So that's a deep question. You have to do some research on fonts in general. So unfortunately, we went through, I don't remember because I wasn't there, but they went through a number of fonts that scale to different languages in general. So they did that. They did those findings pretty much before I ever came to Grab, but they did look at different fonts that did scale. So you do have to do some research on that. And also, which design software tools do you use in Grab? So I'll just speak to mine because everyone's very different. So the tools I usually use are Figma. What else is here? Figma, Overflow, ProtoPie, After Effects for Lottie, Photoshop for GIFs, and well, was abstract, right? So that's what I usually use in general. Any more questions before I end this? So yeah, I've used a lot of different prototyping tools, but ProtoPie has become one of my favorite tools in general. I used to ProtoPie actually in Keynote. So fun fact, everybody at Apple, well, most people in Apple and Pinterest use Keynote to actually prototype their screens, which is pretty wild. They use magic move. So I actually learned from the folks at Pinterest, because most of the people were ex-Apple, and they just prototyped in Magic Move in Keynote, which is pretty awesome. And I've seen some crazy stuff look like actual like screens and flows. So yeah, I mastered that in Keynote, but now I usually use ProtoPie, After Effects, and obviously like InVision's simple, but if you want real-time feedback, I usually push people now to just prototype in ProtoPie, because it's easier to get that feedback and that sensory like feeling from somebody. You can also throw animations in there, which is pretty cool. Sorry, could you repeat what you shared after Figma? What do you mean? I think for Figma is just a good database for a design system, and it's also a good way to just collaborate with people in general. Yeah, so what was the tools I shared? So for ProtoPie, Figma, Overflow, Photoshop, After Effects for Lulti, Abstract, and obviously Illustrator. How involved engineers during user? So yeah, good question on that one. So in our first research sessions, we actually had engineers. So our engineers are in Beijing, specifically for my team, or my X team. And our engineers actually flew down for the design sprint and then for the user research in Indonesia, which is pretty cool. So they were actually involved in the beginning. And sometimes they actually are proactive and do come down randomly for other research sessions. So it was cool because they start to learn and see like what they built and how people actually react to how they built out the app. That's pretty cool, seeing engineers like eyes get their mind blown, because people they'll have assumptions that a certain thing isn't understood by Indonesian users, and then when you go there, they're actually like, oh wow, this is cool that the users actually understand what I built, and that's a cool experience. So I highly encourage getting them involved, because it does help a lot. And I also encourage getting them involved in the ideation stage, because they can also point out some things that may work or may not work. They can call out technological things, whether it's advanced or maybe it's too high for them to do, or maybe it's easy for them to do. So highly encourage engineers in the ideation session. Do you conduct heuristic evaluation on your designs in Grab? Sometimes, it depends on the team. What was it? Oh, so I answered that. What platform do your team use to document design system? Figma right now, but we also have Abstract. How many users do you invite in your user beta testing? So usually we like to name at 6 users. Before, it used to be maybe, well, because it was cheap and easy to do, it's like 3 or 2. And that would just be, multiple sessions now throughout days. So I would do 2 users one day versus another 2 users the other day. But some days, obviously you go through 6 users. So because for us, it's usually good to get 6 users perspective in a day. That's just the number that we usually aim for. How many? Oh, yes, this video will be saved somewhere. And Carol will send it out to you guys. Anything else, folks? I'll take 1 or 2 more questions. Is there a standard process to find and recruit respondents for your research efforts in foreign cultures? Yes, there is, but I think it's different for each company, right? Because it obviously depends on your budget. It depends on who you're looking for, and every country is very different when you're looking for respondents in general. So, example, if someone, so I'll tell a story because I can tell the story. So in Vietnam, right, in Hanoi, a lot of people actually work for the government. So when they go into user research sessions, they're actually a little bit paranoid because they don't want to say anything that may be recorded or whatnot. So one user just marched out because we asked him, "Are you okay being recorded?" And he didn't like that, and he just marched out. So you have to be wary of the foreign culture in general when you're looking for respondents and who they work for, right? Because obviously it might be different for someone in each country, and some people are very sensitive to being actually recorded. So that does happen, unfortunately. So just be wary of that. But yes, there is a process. You just have to make sure that you have someone on the ground, whether it's we usually have our folks reach out to the the local companies that do research, or sometimes we'll actually do the actual research, and we can reach out to users through that. I can't speak to how they actually get the users, but we just usually give them what we're looking for, and then people show up. So I can't speak to that, but that's what usually happens. How many rounds of iteration do you usually do for each release? What's the timeline like? Vet. So so we do have a review process at Grab, and usually it would be nice to just go through 3 sessions, but it could be more than that. So you have to be aware of the critique sessions now and factor that into time. So for each iteration, right, you have to be wary of like what could backfire in the critique session, whether you have to do it again, or maybe you have to rebuild it. But usually it could just be 3 iterations. Timeline, obviously, that depends on with the partnership with product and what they set, of course, and working towards that timeline. Sometimes there'll be delays, whether it's a content thing or it's a product thing. You have to just that'll happen, and you have to plan and be very flexible around that. So obviously, it could be like, hey, this is going to be shipped out in 4 weeks, but through critiques and the content taking long, it might be longer than that. So you have to be a little bit flexible at least. Do you invite new batch of users each time? Yes, we do. For me, sources of design inspiration, oh man. Lately, I was just not looking at digital lately. I've actually not been looking at digital apps. I've been looking at like artwork recently. Obviously, Banksy is like one of my favorite artists because he's just so political. And I can't name, well, there's also like, obviously I'll look on like Pinterest, right, for design inspiration, go figure. And but I won't look at anything digital anymore. I don't want to look at UI stuff. I just want to, I don't even look at Dribbble. The world's become too Dribbleized. So I definitely don't want to look at that. I just want to look at art. Could you recap the steps you take when launching in a totally new country? Say you were to launch, example. Yeah, so if I were to launch in a new country, I would first obviously do some surveys and some user research to see what's happening there, right? You have to actually understand the country that you're going to, what's the language, what's the government like. I think that's the layer thing that I keep bringing up. You have to work with the government nowadays, right? You can't just assume that everyone it's going to be easy to launch in a country. So don't be like Uber and launch in like France randomly and then get closed down. So you have to be aware of the government regulations. You have to be aware of all the things that happen there, right? So be aware of that. And then when you start learning about the country and everything, working with the government, then you can slowly launch your product there. And obviously, once you start launching, do a survey, see the findings, how people react to it, how's it going, how's the business going. Just make sure there's a business plan, right? You don't want to just launch randomly without a business plan or a product plan. Have a vision first, and then go into that country. And then you can start strategizing and evolving your product. Specific time taken for a product. Time changes all the time, right? So for me, usually it's like 4 months, not 4 months, sorry, 4 weeks, depending on the project. But it really depends on the length and how big the project is. All right, I'll take one last question. Okay, this is the last question I'm doing. What are some tips and advice you would to give to UI, UX designers? If there are things, oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I would encourage you to learn how to code. I would also encourage you to learn how to prototype in general. I think the most important part that gets lost, because it's the soft skills that people don't have. People, I think, are very sensitive working with people in general. And that's not just here, it's everywhere. I think it's those soft skills, communicating with teams, communicating with people, having that, conversation with folks and taking feedback and, building off that feedback. Can you get better from that feedback? Can you, improve over the course of your career as becoming a leader. It depends on what your vision is, right? So I recommend putting yourself in internships, putting yourself into, you know, areas where you collaborate with a lot of different people that have different perspectives. My friend has a rule where he only he hangs out with experts that are like high-level experts in sales, in real estate, or business or banking, because he can ask them like X amount of questions and starts understanding their point of view. So my suggestion is to develop that soft skill, you know, work with people or talk to people that have higher skills than you, because you'll start becoming a person of, you know, knowledge. You'll start understanding people. You'll start, you know, easily communicating your ideas to these folks, because they'll obviously, you know, teach you a lot of things, but they'll communicate to you very differently from each perspective. So I think that's what's lacking as a, you know, new UI UX designer. If you don't have those communication skills, I think it's a lost art, I think, lately. So keep that to heart and grow with that in general, especially if you're UI UX designer, because anyone can be a UI UX designer, to be honest. I think, you know, a lot of my best friends that are like designers are like ex-architects or never went to art school. So yeah, anyone can be a UX designer, but what about your soft skills? What about, you know, dealing with feedback? How do you improve over the course of time, and how do you become a leader through that? That'd be my suggestion. Just surround yourself with different type of perspectives, and be very patient and listen to people, because you'll get a lot out of it, not just for yourself, but for your career going forward, developing those relationships, and that's important. Thank you. Yes, thank you guys for coming again. I see some of my colleagues here. Thank you guys for coming and supporting. And thank you. I see some of my friends also here. So thanks, guys. Thank you so much. And I think Carol or Vaibhav will probably send the video guys out, the recording.
Thank you, Jay, for sharing such insightful sessions on designs. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I believe everyone joined today has learned a lot from your session. And thank you, everyone, for your wonderful questions as well. So if you like this session today, please follow our LinkedIn page and our Instagram page as well. And just provide your kind words under the comments. So before I end this meeting, could I just ask everyone to open your video camera so we can take a screenshot of everyone who joined us today? Hey, can I get some?
Come on, guys. You guys can do it. Don't be shy.
Yes. Can I get more smiley faces? I can see a few.
Don't be shy. I know some of you. Put your videos on.
Thank you, guys. Can I get some more? At least I can take one page. Okay, get ready. 3, 2, 1, smile. Great, great, great. Thank you, guys. So I'm just gonna share my screen of my final slide. I just want to say my special thanks to our donors who donated, make a donation to the session. So yeah, Mom, Nick, Shunichi Kashal, Hongting Liu, Darius Sihui, Nicholas, Yash, Peiting, and Sarah. Thank you guys for your kind donations. And yeah, thank you for your time and have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.